Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner, and welcome to tonight's edition of the Robust Opposition. I'm really happy to have with me as my guest tonight, Karen Kwak, who is a candidate for Glendale City Council. And I first met Karen at a Wesleyan alumni event, of all things. It was probably...
I didn't understand that.
Oops, sorry, Bixby. Got to turn off Bixby. It was always popping on when I don't want them to be on. I met Karen at a Wesleyan alumni event, and probably it was right before the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2015, because then I started doing things for LA for Bernie, and Karen was a very avid volunteer. And little did I know at that time that she would end up, running for office. So Karen, why don't you start by telling viewers a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, a little bit about your educational background, what you studied in school, your professional career, and then we'll talk about why you decided to run for office.
Sure. I'm Karen Kwak. I'm 48 years old. I was born in Seoul, Korea, 1974. I remember that as, the year that Nixon resigned. My parents moved to Hawaii in 1976 when I was 2 years old. I have two older sisters and one younger brother. We all grew up in Honolulu, Hawaii. I went to public schools throughout. Oh, by the way, Hawaii has a very interesting way of funding public schools, which I thought was normal. It has nothing to do with property taxes, and it comes out of the general fund every year, but I will get back to that later. Then I went to school at Wesleyan University, like Lauren, because it was a wonderful place where I could study my own way, and my professors there were absolutely wonderful. I majored in English, and then I worked in publishing in New York for about 20 years as a production editor. But the amazing thing is that no matter how much I liked my jobs, I kept losing my jobs due to corporate layoffs. And we're constantly told that it's not your fault. That after the first layoff, you honestly believe that you did something wrong. After the second layoff, you realize, you know what? It really is not my fault. They axed my entire department. And so I started to look around at the larger political and economic forces, why these things keep happening. That was in 2015. That was also around the time that I first heard about Bernie Sanders. And the things he had to say about the economy and politics, it really resonated with me precisely because it hit me right after my second layoff. And then I moved to Boston. I worked for the Office of the State Auditor, my first public service job. I learned a lot about how governments work, that the four layers of government: the federal government, the state government, the county level, and the municipal level. Because before that, I paid attention mostly to the federal and international politics, but I became interested a lot more in how much can be done at the local level. And then actually after Trump got elected, I moved to the California area because honestly, the people in Boston were very racist, that I used to get spat at quite often, very regularly, by the nice people of Boston. I didn't want to be there, after Trump got elected. Okay, so then I moved to Glendale, which it turns out is an actually even more racist town. It's the former home of the KKK, and they passed the Sundown Town Resolution, which I'll get later here. And because it took me a long time to find a job, that I had a long time to explore my community and to join a lot of community groups, I spent a lot of my time with environmental groups, with public banking, and with the tenants union, which were just starting up around that time. And I spent a lot of my time in fighting for rent control and fighting for tenants' rights in general. We made 3 different attempts to install rent control in Glendale, because although the city of Los Angeles has rent control laws, the city of Glendale does not. And so my fellow tenants and I fought for that for a long time, twice via petition and one via lobbying the city council. And we were not successful, not yet. But because of that, I became very interested in how municipal government works. I started attending city council meetings every week. I started asking to meet with council members, to discuss proposals and legislation. And I realized, it's actually amazing how much an ordinary citizen can do, in their local government. And this is really the place to start, not just to understand how laws are passed and policy is shaped, but also getting to know the personalities. I've heard that local government is actually the most difficult level of government because it's so up close and personal that local government is responsible for delivering services directly to residents, like electricity and garbage pickup. And if they fail, then the citizens will come and complain loudly to your face in City Hall, as I have been on that end. But it's also very personal. You can make a direct connection with the people in your neighborhood and with the people in City Hall. I did manage to find work here in the LA area, but so far, no permanent full-time jobs. They've often been part of the gig economy. They're either temp jobs, or they are part-time jobs. And so I've had to call, a living the way many of us do today. Do I actually like this? Not really, but it gave me a very clear understanding of how ordinary people, struggle nowadays to scrape by. And this is even with having a degree from an elite school and 20 years of professional experience. People want to make us feel like we did something wrong, but that is absolutely not the case. This is how the economy works nowadays, and it does not work very well for those of us who did not start out with a lot of capital.
Yeah.
And so I very much speak for the people who are in this situation. The working class and the middle class, our voices are not getting heard in City Hall. That, again, listening to all the concerns in City Hall, that I noticed that it's our voices that don't get heard. And there are very many structural reasons for that, which I will get into. Things like council districts. The concerns of the wealthy are very heard. Probably about 90% of City Hall's time gets heard by those concerns. But for example, Glendale is a city where 67% are renters, but we are not represented in City Hall at all unless we take the initiative to come and tell them about our problems. Otherwise, they will completely ignore us. And that is, I was actually looking for a political candidate to say the things that I wanted to hear, and I could not find one. That's why I decided that I had to be the one to say them. The last thing in the world I ever thought I would do was run for office. I'm completely the wrong personality. I don't like pushing my face in other people's faces. I don't like to talk about myself. I don't like to tell everyone my name. But somebody has to say these things. Somebody has to speak for tenants. Somebody has to speak for the working class. And unfortunately, it has to be me right now because I can't find anyone else to say things in the same way with the same perspective.
Okay. All right. You got to let me in here because this is not your campaign speech. I want you to get all this stuff out, but I need to do it in a question and answer sort of form. So we got way beyond your qualifications. Clearly, you are a citizen activist. Let's drill down to one particular area that you did in terms of renters' rights. Talk about that one issue, what exactly you were able to accomplish, how you were able to accomplish it, the different groups and people you worked with, because this will tell viewers how you would operate as a legislator.
I have shaped policy in several different ways. The one that comes first to mind is the creation of the Tenant Landlord Committee. That last year, especially dealing with all of the emergency laws that were passed by various levels of government during the pandemic concerning tenants, it became really obvious that, again, the people who run City Hall are not renters and they don't have a first-hand understanding of these issues. So in order to create a platform for tenant voices to get heard, that I worked with the City Council and with community groups. These were specifically the Glendale Tenants Union and the Coalition for an Anti-Racist Glendale. That I sent a proposal to a City Council through the coalition in February. And then I followed up by asking for meetings, jointly with GTU members and with coalition members, with individual City Council members for a couple of months after that. And I got a very good response from all of them. They agendized their item and they agreed to hear it in June 2021. And that vote actually passed 5-0. Now, this committee is composed of both tenants and landlords, 3 tenant seats, 3 landlord seats, and 1 neutral party. And this is precisely because I firmly believe that these issues can be solved if we actually sit down at a table together and talk about our different perspectives. And the landlord's perspective is honestly very well represented at City Hall. The voice that's missing is, again, the tenant's perspective. And so that it's not left to the individual tenant to come to City Hall and speak up, which can be very intimidating, that I want to create a platform, like this is a systemic change, so that there is a standing platform for tenants to use to have their perspectives and issues heard. Now this, as you know, committees take a long time to get started. This was passed in June. It was formalized in August of last year. The committee itself didn't have its first meeting until March of this year. and they're still trying to find their way to figure out exactly what their roles are and how to find their way forward. But I'm very happy and I'm very proud that we have this new platform to make crucial tenant landlord issues heard. And
Let's
this
talk about some other issues. Now, first of all, Glendale is its own city. It should be noted that Los Angeles is a very big megalopolis. You know, there's like 9 million people in Los Angeles County. Los Angeles City is the biggest city in it, but then there's some smaller cities like Beverly Hills, Santa Monica, West Hollywood, and Glendale. So talk about why it's better to be a small city rather than being just part of Los Angeles. What can you do? Like, for instance, when I was in Beverly Hills, I worked with the mayor, who was a conservative. Well, I shouldn't say he called himself a Prius Republican because he's an environmentalist. He was educated in Sweden. He believed in the precautionary principle. He didn't think we should do things until they were proven safe. And we do the exact opposite in this country. So even though he's a Republican, I worked with him and Food and Water Watch to get Beverly Hills to be the first and only city to ban fracking. Now, some counties have banned fracking, but Beverly Hills was able to do that because they are its own city. So talk about some of the things that make it easier to affect change in a city like Glendale. And aside from tenants' rights, what other issues are the top issues in your platform?
Glendale is a city of about 200,000 people. And it's true that we're basically mostly a suburb of the larger megalopolis of Los Angeles. But because Los Angeles is so huge, it can be very difficult and very unwieldy to try to get new legislation passed. With a small city, they're actually far more likely to entertain new ideas. You know, that our city council meetings are held at 6 p.m., for example. So we frequently get very lively comments from the general public because many of them are at home and they can air their concerns. And again, you can have an intimate relationship with your council members. They know who you are. Whereas in LA, I have been to LA city council meetings. They're held during the day, and you have basically like the same three people talking about I have no idea what over and over again. But it doesn't seem to be as effective as the intimate setting you can get in a small city. Now, does it always work? No, because the representation we have in Glendale, that we don't have districts like LA, that all the city council members are elected at large. So in many ways, the government is more conservative than the general population. So there are advantages, there are drawbacks. But there was an issue passed by the council last year about Mylar balloons, that they actually banned Mylar balloons because they can interfere with the electrical lines, and cause outages. That was actually easier to pass as a small city. Now, I'm going to say, even though we're a small city, that different groups from all over the state called in to object to it because they did not want a small city to set a precedent that might be adopted by other cities and have a domino effect across the state. So in some ways, it helps to be a small city, and in other ways it doesn't. In terms of a lot of
the other issues in your platform besides, yeah.
The first issue that brought me to City Hall was actually water issues about the Metropolitan Water District's plan to create the Delta tunnels. This was back in 2017.
Oh yeah, I thought that also.
That I met with activists from the Food and Water Watch, and they explained the 40-year history that they've spent trying to fight the same Delta tunnels. Comes up over and over again. And honestly, this was my biggest doubt about moving to the Los Angeles area, and that's what I thought about you, Lauren. What a smart move to go to North Carolina. I believe that people should live where there is water. Right now, we're in a mega drought. We've been in this for 20 years. I have no idea if we're ever going to recover. Some people say that it's inaccurate to call it a drought. It's actually part of global warming. And I do like to point out, although people like to focus on energy issues because they're sexier for some reason, that honestly, that throughout human history, humans have lived without any kind of electricity at all, or any kind of vehicles at all, other than the last 200 years. But we cannot live without clean water. And there are two water issues: water supply and water quality. Now, the city of Glendale, like much of Southern California, relies on imported water. That's water drawn to us by various aqueducts from other places in the state and sometimes from other states. So in order to reduce our reliance on imported water, that I believe we need to focus on our local water supplies. And there are several projects that the Metropolitan Water District is running on, for example, with stormwater capture and reuse, so that we can use the water locally instead of just throwing it away like wastewater in storm drains. And also, I'm very concerned with microplastics and PFAS. That it's very alarming that about 97% of all humans on the planet have PFAS in our systems. And we're only starting to understand exactly what that's doing to our health.
Why don't you define that?
That perfluorocarbon substances. There are about 5,000 substances. These are most closely identified with DuPont's Teflon and Scotchgard. That even though we don't get PFAS directly from using a Teflon-coated pan, for instance, these chemicals, they're called forever chemicals. That I'm not going to get too much in the chemistry, but they're long-chain molecules that are almost impossible to break down. So once they're in our bodies, they're there forever. There's absolutely no way we can remove them from our systems. So if 97% of the planet has PFAS in their systems, we're going to have them in our blood until we die. That these substances are also found in newborns, that they're actually born this way. And a lot of this is caused through the manufacturing process. It goes through our water. It's in our carpets. That it's almost impossible to even in places in the Arctic we find evidence of PFAS. There are about 5,000 different types of PFAS. We can only test for about 40 or 50 of them, and that in itself is alarming. But there are ways to remove it from our water system, like with various carbon filters. So there are some things we can do now, but we're only actually starting to deal with this massive problem.
Is this something you could deal with on a citywide level, though?
This would have to be dealt with through the Metropolitan Water District. That they have started looking into programs. As I said, there are ways to filter the water to remove the known PFAS out of our water supply, and there are ways to contain it. But again, we're only dealing with the ones that we know, which is basically 1/10 of those in existence. The main problem right now is we need to stop manufacturing them. Like the state of California has already started this by banning certain types of products that babies and children use that are known to contain PFAS. And so that's the step, to stop it at the point of manufacture before it even gets to the consumer.
Okay, so we've talked about environment, we've talked about renters. What about education? Do you have a platform plank on education?
Here in Glendale, the schools are actually run by a separate entity, by the Glendale Unified Schools District. So the city has absolutely no say in the schools. So I have not been talking about it actively, but as I mentioned before, that the school funding systems need to change. I was actually appalled when I was in Massachusetts that so much of school funding is dependent on local property taxes, because honestly, that's a way to guarantee inequality for everyone. Simply,
well, in California, they have it also, but they have a local funding formula that sort of equalizes it. But I think a bigger issue, maybe I should have phrased it this way, is universal pre-K, because, the federal government is trying to do it. It was in Joe Biden's Build Back Better plan that he couldn't get passed. John Mirisch, that same Beverly Hills City Councilman I was telling you about, just proposed that Beverly Hills provide free child care to all residents and all employees of the city. Now, I said to him, how many people are going to take advantage of that? How much is it going to cost? How are you going to pay for it? And he said, we haven't looked into that. Right now, we're just going to have a study session on it, because that's what they do there. They have study sessions. And I thought, wow, that's great, because we all know that child care is so expensive. It's so hard to find child care. It's especially hard to find good child care. We don't pay child care workers nearly what they're worth, considering they're caring for our most precious possession, not possession, but you know what I mean, our most precious whatever, our children. Same thing with people who care for our aging parents. We don't pay them very much either. So if you could, on a city level, now I don't know what your budget is like there. We all know that California right now has $100 billion budget surplus. That's amazing. And I just read in Politico California today that Newsom is talking about pre-K. There's several contrary bills for pre-K in the state. But what have you talked about it on a city level? And if so, what could you do?
Oh, actually, the how do you pay for it question is crucial to progressives, is it not? That's
Well, I mean, I believe in modern monetary theory, and we can pay for endless wars. We can pay for tax cuts for billionaires. We can pay to subsidize the fossil fuel industry. We can pay for what they want. But when it comes to social services, how are you going to pay for it? But cities do have to balance their budget.
yes, and at the federal level, it's very much modern monetary theory, which I would be happy to bore anyone silly about at a later time. But at the municipal level, I've been working on public banking. The state of California passed a public banking law 3 years ago. This was actually passed with a lot of widespread mainstream support. This is actually not an issue that only progressives are interested in. Moderates were also very interested in public banking. Now, the law as passed allowed for pilot projects that they're going to release up to 10 licenses across the state. Now, the city of Los Angeles, I've been working with the Public Bank LA group. They have successfully lobbied the LA City Council to take the first steps towards starting a municipal bank of LA. Now, it's a very long multi-step process. They were just at the beginning that they're releasing a request for proposals. Then they will study the issue, as you mentioned, Lauren. They always have to study it first, and then after they get the report in about a year, then they will take the next step to see how they're going to apply. But people ask, what is a public bank? A public bank is exactly the same as a commercial bank. It is not run by the government. It is a professional bank run by professional bankers. The only difference is that it has a mandate to serve the public and the people, as opposed to maximizing profit for a corporation. Now, this means that we can fund projects that actually help our communities as opposed to drawing money away from them. We can fund projects like schools. For example, any large infrastructure project, for example, like building a large school, and this is where schools come in, if a project costs $400 million, about half of that, or $200 million, goes toward paying the financing for the project. It goes toward paying the interest on the bonds. And I was completely surprised when I saw that. So imagine that if we got a public bank and we qualified for much cheaper financing at the Fed funds window as a bank, then that financing would go down to almost zero, perhaps 0.25%. And we could save $200 million out of a $400 million infrastructure project. Now, and that's how, even though schools are separate from cities at the municipal level, this will help any public entity. If we have access to a municipal bank, it will help every single public agency finance their operations better, not just for the large infrastructure projects, but also for our day-to-day financing, like handling payroll. The city of LA pays, I believe, something like $1 billion a year in just these routine fees to banks. Now, think about what we can do with that money if we saved it for the public as opposed to sending it to a private bank.
Okay, well, I'm going to stop you right there because I've done many shows on public banks. I covered the public banking conference up in San Rafael in 2013. I've had Ellen Brown on my show many times. I've interviewed Trinity Tran, and I also got John Chung interested in a public bank when he was the controller, because the Bank of North Dakota, which is the only state bank that we have left, because in the beginning, the colonies all had their own banks. So the Bank of North Dakota got, I think, 15 or 21% IRR, internal rate of return, one year. And it was the same year that, well, because what I said to John Chung when I saw him at an event was, I said, we should start a public bank. He said, what are we going to finance it with? And my first answer was, the taxes that you take in. And he says, well, the taxes go out as soon as we take it in, and we're running a deficit. This is before they're now running the surplus. And I said, well, what about the state pension funds? You've got CalPERS and CalSTRS. And he said, oh, we have to provide, we have a fiduciary duty to those pensioners. We have to provide them a certain rate of return every year. And I said, oh, well, that's interesting, because this year you only got a 2% rate of return, whereas the Bank of North Dakota got a 21% rate of return. And he was like, really? Tell me more about that. So I gave him all sorts of information. And then his first foray into proposing it was really in conjunction with legalizing cannabis, because there is no money, because cannabis is still a federally Schedule I drug. You can't use the regular banking system. So if they were going to legalize and have recreational marijuana, where were all these companies, these stores, going to put their money? So they were talking about this kind of a bank. And then they were also talking about an infrastructure bank. So there's been various iterations. They've also talked about postal banking, allow post offices to raise money by, handling remittances and things of that nature. So I'm very much knowledgeable, and I want to, maybe I'll post some links since we started talking about public bank to some of my shows with Ellen Brown. But we don't want to run out of time before we talk about your campaign. So here you are. You have never run for a public office before. You're a citizen activist, which is great. You've got stuff done, which is great. How does somebody like you run for office? I imagine you're corporate free. You wouldn't accept corporate money or special interest money, not that they'd probably want to give it to you, but it takes money to run a campaign. I know certain people just want to use volunteers, but that isn't always the most successful way. So talk about your campaign, how that's been going, and then we'll get into who your opponents are.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I'm running a corporate-free campaign that all contributions have come from individuals. I'm very proud to say that my average donation is about $60. Now that changes every day, but it's usually around $60, which is crucial. Yes, that is actually part of my platform too. We need campaign finance reform. This, I'm told, is not an election winning issue, but these are actually the nuts and bolts that actually allow progressives to run for office and win. That this actually has come up in Glendale last year, that one of our council members, Artie Kasakian, proposed a bill on public financing of campaigns that we got partial success for it. There's a $2,700 candidate statement fee that's charged by the county just to have our candidate statements printed and the sample ballots mailed out to all voters.
That's a lot.
Yes, and so that was a start, that he got a bill passed that the city of Glendale will pay for that $2,700 candidate fee for any candidate who's going to raise less than $50,000 for any campaign. And so that's the step. We also pushed for matching donations to amplify the voice of the grassroots. That one didn't pass, but we got to start. That's a crucial point. You have to start somewhere. And once you get started, you can build on in the future. And that's actually a good question. So honestly, I first started out watching city council meetings, honestly, because I had a hard time finding a job. And what do you do when you're new in town? You want to learn more about your town and you have more time than money. So I also consider it to be free entertainment. I greatly enjoyed watching what the city does, learning more about it. And after a few weeks, I started noticing, you know what? I don't think these people really know what they're talking about. The feeling it was very much that I'm walking into an alternate universe. The concerns they talk about seem to have very little connection with my real world and with the real world of the people I talk to. And the more I listened to it, I thought, that you tend to give government the benefit of the doubt. I find that people do this all the time. They respect the job title and without seeing exactly how the city functions on a day-to-day basis. And I think this is the crucial mistake that most voters make, that they believe things that politicians say on the campaign trail, but they never actually check on the job performance. And when people look at on the job performance, they might be very surprised. And honestly, this is not hard to understand. Would you hire someone and then never check to see how they're actually performing their job? This is unfortunately how most voters act.
Well, let's give an example, because I know who you're talking about right now. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Dan Brotman, who we were lauding just 2 years ago because he was able to, our climate group that I was working in, he was able to reduce the amount of frack gas that you were using in the city, shutting or reducing the amount coming from this power plant. But talk about what you said to me in the pre-interview. Don't confuse an environmentalist for a progressive, and specifically how that related to his action on tenant issues.
Yes, that's one of the groups I joined when I moved to Glendale was the Glendale Environmental Coalition. That was a group that Dan Brotman started precisely to fight the gas plant in Glendale, which affects, as you can imagine, not just Glendale, but all of the surrounding areas. It's a regional issue. And I was very happy to work on a project with a very specific goal. We want to reduce the amount of natural gas it relies on and expand the use of solar and battery power. And he led the fight on that, which I greatly appreciated. And that was in July 2019. They won a huge victory. They reduced 262 megawatts of natural gas down to 93. And that was basically why Dan Brotman won the election in March 2020, which I and a bunch of tenant groups worked very hard for. And because he also, when he talked about different areas of his campaign, he also supported tenants' rights and rent stabilization. That we found, for example, that's a campaign promise. But when you look at on-the-job performance, that campaign promise never got filled. That, in fact, he stated very publicly in August 2021 that he's against rent control, he's against rent stabilization, and that now he's completely lost the support of the tenants because he never fulfilled his campaign promise. And now he's being endorsed by the Realtors Association and owners, who, as you can imagine, are some of the biggest opponents of tenants.
Yeah.
That's an example of people need to hold our elected officials accountable and see how they actually perform on the job. And if people did more of this and actually followed the council meetings regularly as I do, they would get a very different view. These are people, we should not put these people up on a pedestal. They are people just like you and me, setting policy. And people would be surprised at, honestly, there are a lot of people on the street who can come in and watch a council meeting and can probably do a better job than the people in those offices.
Yeah.
People should not underestimate themselves and do not overestimate our elected officials.
Now, tell us who your other opponents are and what your assessment is of them.
Right now, Glendale does not have council districts. So in a city of 200,000 people, we have 5 council members. They are all elected at large. Now, this results in a system where all 5 out of 5 council members represent the north of Glendale. They're all homeowners who live in nice suburbs. This is precisely why tenant concerns are not heard, because South Glendale, where most tenants live, is not represented at all. That is actually one of my key platform positions. We need council districts to make sure, this is structural systemic reform to make sure that all areas of the city are fairly represented, regardless of which individuals serve. Now, that bill also came up last year, also brought up by Artie Kasakian. It went down 2 to 3. Okay, so because of that, we have in our large system, there are 3 seats up this year. There are 3 incumbents. Dan Brotman is one of them. Aaron Najarian, a Republican, is another, although this is a nonpartisan race. And Reg Agajanian is the 3rd incumbent. Now, the curious fact is that all of these 3 incumbents live in the exact same zip code, which is very nice for the people who live in that zip code. You know, they have 3 representatives to choose from. The people who live in my zip code, which is the 2nd poorest in the city, have absolutely nobody. And honestly, incumbents often have a heavy advantage. Okay, there are 5 other challengers. There's me. There are actually 4 women running this time, which is fantastic. 50-50, we're balanced. The other ladies are Elena Satrian, my friend Isabel Tabanyan Valencia, who is also a member of the Glendale Tenants Union, and Anita Quinones Gabrielian, who used to serve on the GCC for many years.
What does that stand for? Glendale Community College?
Yes, Glendale Community College. I'm sorry. I'm talking to locals. And there's a newcomer, Jordan Henry, whom has lived in Glendale for about 1.5 years. And honestly, that in itself, to me, rings a bell. It's like, why would you move to a city and think that you're qualified to run it after 1 year? But he's been endorsed by the police union. And yeah, he's been known for making a lot of comments about critical race theory at GUSD for many. Yes.
What is your opinion, since we're talking about police right now, on defunding the police? We all know that it doesn't really mean that. It really means reallocating resources. Where does that issue stand in Glendale? Is it a hot button issue with people or not really?
Oh, I joke about it this way, that we have all 5 out of 5 council members very anxious to please the police, that they are actually increasing police staffing by 6 positions this year. In the middle of holding budget study sessions, and that's what they said. They're increasing the police by 6 positions. One of those is funded by a grant, but the rest are being funded out of the general fund. And whenever the police request any type of resources, that the city council simply rubber stamps it 5 to 0. There are a few questions asked sometimes, but not enough. And I was actually reminded by a fellow member of the Coalition for Anti-Racist Glendale, who is a pastor, that let's beat swords into plowshares. And I said, wow, you know what? That was the original way to say, let's defund the police. This is actually not a new concept at all. It's let's use our resources to fund the necessities of life instead of fighting each other. This is not a new concept. This is not hard to understand. And especially when we hear heartbreaking stories like the mass shootings in the last couple of weeks, that how do we solve problems at the root causes? It's by making sure that people's basic needs are met. Now, this is not a short-term solution. This is a long-term solution. We're not going to see results right away. But basically, how do you intercept these problems that if you're waiting until people are ready to buy a gun, you've actually waited too long, that we need to intercept them long before that. Now, do I have problems with gun control? Absolutely not. But that can't be the only solution. It has to be part of a larger solution. The way we prevent this from happening 10, 20 years down the line, not just tomorrow, is by taking care of people's basic needs at the root causes. Now, is defund the police popular in Glendale? Not right now, but I am one of the people who went to rallies in 2000, including the one at 3rd and Fairfax on May 30th, 2020.
Oh, yeah.
Very much holding signs saying defund the police. That's exactly what we mean. We need to fund the things that people need to live on, as opposed to trying to put our funds into enforcement. Oh, I do have a story about that. I have a lot of direct experience with the police that shows that they're at best completely useless.
Yeah.
And that is not the best way to spend public funds at all.
Well, I just found out that there's 2 Supreme Court cases that show that the police have no legal obligation to protect people. And, I posted something by Sagar and Getty. I don't know if you ever listened to Rising. Well, it used to be Rising, but now it's Breaking Points with Crystal Ball and Sagar and Getty. And he's the conservative of the two, but he's not a MAGA conservative. He makes some very good points. And he did a commentary the other day on Uvalde, and he basically said the NRA is not the problem. It's a practically bankrupt organization. He says owning guns is very popular, and it's correlated with trust in government and trust in institutions and trust in other people. He said in the 60s, the trust level in government and other people was in 70, 81%. Now it's 20, 30%. So people don't trust that the government's going to take care of them. They don't trust other people are going to not hurt them. So everybody's arming themselves. In the last year, 5 million Americans bought guns. Before that, in the first year of the pandemic, another 5 million Americans bought guns. Now, 100 million Americans own guns. So, it's not only just a situation of people's economic and social needs. I think it has to do with this malaise, to use a word from the Jimmy Carter era. It's just this malaise that's kind of taken over our people. And I think it's 40 years of neoliberalism, quite frankly, this Ayn Randian philosophy of it's the individual's fault. We're all on our own, every man for themselves. There's no concern about the collective. Now, you come from a country, Korea, an Asian society where there is a lot more concern about the collective. And that's why they were able to get the pandemic under control a lot easier, because people didn't mind, being monitored or having to stay home or do whatever they had to do, because they recognized that it was for everybody's good. It wasn't an infringement on their individual freedom. And that's how they have us not joining together in solidarity and fighting them. That's how come the 1% is more powerful than the 99%. If the 99% ever got together, which is why the Occupy movement was, even before the Bernie movement, was what got me radicalized. And I remember, was talking to Shervin Azami about this, because he's running against Brad Sherman for Congress. And I remember Occupy, they were occupying a house in Sherman Oaks that was being foreclosed upon, and they managed to evade foreclosure for 1 solid year. And Occupy Fights Foreclosures, which was Carlos Marroquin's group, was having meetings out of there. And Bilal Ali, who's an OG, he's literally part of, the Black Panthers in the 60s. He was running Occupy the Hood. And he said to me, Lauren, you'd be surprised if we did a walk around a 1 mile radius of this house, how many of these other homes are in foreclosure too. So I'm like, oh, Bilal, you should gather them all together and go to Brad Sherman's office and say you refuse to leave unless he does something about it. And he said to me, you know what, Lauren? They're all embarrassed. They all feel that they did something wrong. They lost their home because of a personal failure. And that's why we can't do something like that. So it's exactly what you were talking about before. And so I don't know how you change attitudes with policies. I mean, we have to change the policies, but you also have to change the attitudes too.
Yes, that is. Oh, you brought up many different issues. Okay, so where do I start? Yes, I grew up in Hawaii, which Asians are dominant. You know that Asians run most levels of government, and that's precisely where our policies are positively socialist in many ways, as with school funding. And yes, Asian cultures very much are about taking care of the family, the extended family, and the community. If you look at the model of a Korean house or a Chinese house, it's meant to house 3 generations under one roof. That it's not about the individual. The individual always takes second place to the community. We do what's good for the community. That's why exactly the example you cited in Korea, that they were very quick at stamping out the COVID when it first came out, because people were willing to give up the individual rights in order to consent to things like contact tracing. You know, the government paid out a small stipend to pay people to stay at home, you know, for the public good. So people were completely willing to give up a small amount of their individual liberties in order to preserve the public good. And there was actually also an example of that in the Asian financial crisis in '98, that you had Koreans, you know, personal savings to help the state solve its financial crisis. I'm going to point out with MMT that's not actually necessary, but there's very much the spirit of we're all in this together. Let's all give up a little bit of something of ourselves to help the common good. And I absolutely agree that's completely the result of neoliberalism. How do we fix that? Honestly, the short answer is MMT. How do we get there? That honestly, the problem is so large. Where do we start? We have to find somewhere to chip away. These problems are all interconnected. You find just one little corner to start chipping away, and then you will find ways to get to all of the corners. That's why my focus is actually on housing. The way to start it is by decommodifying housing, and that's a very specific policy proposal I have with the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, that we allow tenants to buy the buildings that they live in, so that they're no longer paying rent, which I call throwing money down a black hole every month, that they're building equity and they're running it cooperatively, that they have not a chance to just build equity, but also to control where and how they live.
But how do you force a landlord? How do you force a landlord, especially now that so many of them are corporate landlords and private equity firms? It's crazy how big that is getting. How can you force them to give up their property to like a co-op or a land trust or something like that?
Actually, the first proposal, TOPA, is not about forcing landlords to sell. It's that there are a number of landlords who are already willing to sell. But the problem is the process is so opaque that the tenants very often don't even know that the building they're living in has been offered for sale. So the first step is just to let the tenants know that their building has been put on the market, and would they like the opportunity to purchase it. And that's all. We can start there. One very small step that actually doesn't even require financing. City Council could pass it tomorrow. It could be passed at any level, city, county, or state. That's all we want. Just tell us when the building is going on sale so we can think about whether we want to buy it or not. Okay, that's something that the LA City Council did just last Friday, was they actually used eminent domain to start purchasing a building in Chinatown to convert it into permanently affordable housing for the tenants. Not going into too much detail, but usually these affordable housing units, quote, affordable housing units, are built on long-term covenants. The covenant was just about to expire. It's been 30 years. That was 3 years ago. And so the tenants who already live there and call it home would have been forced to pay huge rent increases or move elsewhere, which most of them cannot afford to do. Again, this is a multi-step process, but the city of LA took the first step toward actually using eminent domain to purchase this building on behalf of those tenants. And there are multiple ways. It doesn't have to be tenants buying it directly from landlords. It can be the state or a public agency buying it from landlords, or it can be a community land trust. This is the model often in use. A community land trust actually provides the financing to buy the building from the landlord, and then turns it into a limited equity co-op for the tenants to live in.
Yeah, you should talk to Matthew Snyder out in Riverside, because he's doing that. He's another Bernie person, and he can help you with that. So if you don't win your election, you can go and work on that, and then I'll have you on the show to talk about that. So the final question is, your election is next Tuesday. It's called a primary, but it really is going to decide who the city council members are. What kind of help could you use from viewers if they want to help you? How can they get in touch with you?
Oh, actually, I just got an email from a volunteer today that you could help me send text messages to voters in the city. I have voter rolls. I can just email it to anyone who's interested in. These are my voters. These are their phone numbers. And this is a script that you can just cut and paste and send out text as many as you can. Yes, it's a little bit boring, but it'll be effective in reaching a lot of people very quickly. And I believe it's more effective than advertising because, people pay attention to the text they get on their phones. We don't pay as much attention to ads that we see on social media.
Right. Well, what's really interesting here is they have greeters, poll greeters, and I'd never seen that in LA or anywhere else that I'd voted, New York, Connecticut, Massachusetts, because they say that a lot of people, they go and they want to vote and they literally don't know who to vote for until they get there. So that's why having poll greeters is so important. And have you ever heard of that?
Yes, actually, the last time I lived in Salem, actually, they weren't poll greeters, but on election day, there were a lot of people out, trying to encourage tenants to vote in the local election. Voters, sorry, did I say tenants?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, people like me, voted regularly, but I wasn't that aware of the local issues. So I actually would have been very glad to find someone neutral to tell me about what the issues were and who the candidates were. I think that's, yeah.
So now, can you, would you want to share your email address or how do you want people to get a hold of you?
Oh, absolutely. It's very easy to find me. I'm a Kwak for Change. Can I type it into the chat?
Yeah, you can.
Easier. And this actually doubles not just as a website, but also as a slogan. Very easy to remember.
Wait, why don't I see it?
It's Kwak for Change. Oh, this is actually one of my postcards. It's here if you would like to see it.
Yeah, I think this is maybe our internal chat.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, that's your website. Is there a way to get in touch with you on it?
Yes, my website has info on how to reach me. My email address is karen@kwakforchange.com.
All right, I'm going to put that. Karen@kwakforchange.com. Okay, we're going to put this here. And then we're going to put it on the screen.
Yay!
Yeah. So really, I wish you great luck. I mean, like all Wesleyan graduates, you're extremely smart. You're extremely prepared. You would make an excellent public servant. If you don't win this time around, because a lot of people, it takes them 2 runs, would you consider running in the next election?
Absolutely. I'm going to keep fighting for tenants' rights and council districts regardless of the election outcome.
Great. All right. Thank you very much, Karen. And everybody, please share the show. If you like what you saw, share the show. And I'm probably not going to do a show next week because I'm going to be doing a fundraiser here in Asheville featuring Bill McKibben. And I'm going to be interviewing him in front of everybody at the fundraiser. And that will be live streamed. So I'm going to be preparing for that. I doubt I'm going to do a show next week. So my next show will probably be June 15th. So thank you, everybody. Keep fighting and also share this show.
Thank you very much. It was great talking to you again, Lauren.
Same here. Bye.